All right. Hello. Good morning. Welcome to the 13th episode of SecuriTEA Crumpets, where we host security professionals each month to talk about different security topics. Today, I'm delighted to have Liran Tal on the show. Liran is the Director of Developer Advocacy at Snyk. He is an author and contributes to various open source projects, where through his work, he is recognized as an impactful developer through the GitHub Star program. He is on the Nodejs Security Working Group, and he's worked in various software engineering roles and also has founded and sold a company. Welcome, Liran. Welcome to the stream.
Hey, Luis, thank you for having me. This is so cool and exciting to be here.
I completely agree. So this is quite an interesting thing because the last time we saw each other was in AppSec Tel Aviv a few years ago. I think that was the first time we actually officially met, and obviously that was a fantastic event. And it's just so nice to have be able to speak to you in person again.
It was amazing having you there. Do you remember where we met? It was at the Node Security Best Practices workshop thing.
It was, yeah. So it was. I can't remember what the guy's name was, but I know he was from New York. So we went to the Nodejs Security training, and it was actually pretty nice. It gave obviously, lots of already knowns, but it still gave a lot of new context into the way some people think about Node.js security. And we are going to talk about security. At least node components today at some.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. 2 years back, just before COVID started, I think.
It was, I think it was in 2019, so late 2019 or somewhere around that time. But yeah, it was a really fun time. So I've got a bit of an icebreaker for anyone watching today. I've already seen a couple of people wave in the stream, so thank you for checking out the stream today. But I obviously, I've been following you on Twitter for a very long time, and I've always noticed the Yoda hat, and obviously, I think your partner had to come and deliver it to you today because I mentioned it. But I would just like to know, where did the Yoda hat start? Why, where did it come from? Why have you been wearing it for so long? What has been going on?
Right, cool. I don't know if I'm going to spill the whole story, but I've got a Yoda hat from I don't know, a decade back or 10 years ago, or something like that, or less. And I bought it because it was fun and useful. It was practical. I'm a practical engineer. This was I was cold and I was upward or I think we were visiting Paris and went to all the stuff. So I bought it back then, and I think some few years back I was thinking, hey, you know what? I like that photo of me taken with the Yoda hat on as well. We're at the train station. And, I use that anyway for some of the avatars and profile on social media. Thinking, you know what, I'm gonna go on stage in one of the talks and I'll just wear the hat and we'll see how that goes. And it just kept. So that's kind of that's it.
Got it. That's actually pretty funny. So I have quite a funny story too. So because I don't have a lot of imagination when it comes to when it comes to creating characters in video games. So I just choose things that are around me. So when I lived in San Francisco, I basically created a character called Carl the Fog. And during the pandemic, things obviously Tiger King came out, and that's where this Carl Baskin thing came from because I was called Carl the Fog in game. People would call me Carl because they didn't know my actual name. And now I have all of these silly props to for this is the Carol Baskin kind of crown that one of my friends made me. So I can understand how things just evolve sometimes. So that's actually I'm glad that I finally know at least it was probably from a family trip kind of thing, and you got it in Paris, and then and that's just where it kind of evolved.
It is.
Awesome.
Simple.
So you've had quite. I looked at your LinkedIn. I like to always kind of do a bit of an investigation of people around before.
It's kind of process on us.
Yeah, you need to do a bit of boasting, of course. And obviously, from what I've seen, you've had quite a diverse and interesting career in terms of job roles. You've worked as a developer. You've co-founded companies. Obviously now you're the head of developer relations or DevRel at Snyk. So could you give the listeners some background into your career path and how things may have evolved, and how you became working at Snyk?
Yeah, definitely. It's so I think it's an interesting question about career path because I definitely did not live my life towards this kind of role, and things kind of evolved but I was into security and computers back in the day ever since. So I've been growing with computers since I was a child, and it started off for me, I think, more I'd say more seriously when we were like I was sharing this tweet back then. I was like, raise your hand if you like were coding on this tool, and I was like sharing a Visual Basic screenshot. I was like, I'm gonna get a lot of hits on that one probably. uh, that's being old school like that, and I think that's kind of like where we started with QBasic for me back then. And I didn't at that point even have like a personal computer at home, so like I remember writing programs on a notebook and going home, typing it all in. My friend's home, typing it all in, and he was also the one with back then with like the modem. So that's how we discovered BBSs. And later on in my teens, around I think the age of 15 or so, just started running my own BBS as well. So it was like taking definitely like that kind of like took me towards where computers was like a very, very significant part of my life, and like how I was socially interacting with people, as like understanding and knowing what to do and stuff like that. So that is also where security started for me back then. Like hack text files, all of those stuff. So like I'm a sucker for all of that. Like punk, I don't know, hack or synth back then, which had an interest. It probably evolved into interesting aspects in different locations. So fast forward high school, which no one cares about. Some military. I don't know. I try to forget. But yeah, I don't know. Like fast forward into life, I guess. I started doing more like not even software development, but because of like the whole BBS, those Linux and system administration was like a thing back then. I don't know, involved into DevOps or whatever. But this is what we did back then. So I was like part of like an integration company, was doing a lot of those Linux sysadmin stuff, like bringing up servers, radio servers, Asterisk. That's how I got into a lot of like the voice over IP and embeddable kind of like a operating system area. And during one of my degree studies, this is where I had like the 180 flip. Whereas like working day to day doing like make files for Linux and embeddable stuff, and actually in my evening time I was actually building a web application. It was like completely the opposite from like C and PHP, or to an extent. There's like a funny story there, I guess. But that's how I like got into like more serious web development. And I've been on the web and the internet just like everyone else, like the child of the 90s. But doing the web development, this is really how it started for me. So I love like the PHP, the HTML, the old school stuff, doing JavaScript stuff back then. And it then evolved into more like serious roles, like being a web developer at HP, where we built like a marketplace around the whole content management system. That's where I think I've also like evolved a lot personally in my skills, and then manager skills and stuff like that. And then again, fast forward a bit, like a few years, because I've been there for like 6 years, I think that's that part. Simon, who was the former head of DevRel, right now it's actually someone else. It's not me. It's Randall Deggs, who's like a really cool guy coming in from Okta for the team. But Simon back then, Simon Maple, he's a Java champion, like really known figure. He was running 3 years ago Snyk's own developer advocacy relations team. I was like tweeting at me with like DMs. I was like, hey, what's up? What's going on? Good. And I knew Snyk back then. I think I actually interviewed for Snyk at some point before changing jobs. And I was thinking, Snyk is too small. I don't know if that's what I want to do right now. Yeah, funny story. Here I am. But back then, I was also already at that point. Like this is 2018, 19. And back then I was also like already part of like the Nodejs Security Working Group. I was doing a lot of like this travel and talks, even though it was like a web team lead for the company. I was doing this as like a no hobby, or like what I like to do. I was doing a lot of open source, a lot of Node.js, a lot of security. And if you think about it, that's kind of like the role that I'm doing now. So it took me a couple of months to figure out that I want to say yes and try this whole developer advocacy relations kind of thing, because I think that like coming from an engineering world, it's really hard. But kind of like made that decision, and zero regrets. It's like it's amazing, because I'm doing everything I'm like passionate for and have been doing in my basically spare time as a hobby. But now this is what I do. So I'm like super excited here.
So I actually had a follow-up question to that. So you mentioned like going from from a developer side of things to DevRel. It was kind of hard. Like, could you kind of like expand on that? Because I feel that maybe some people feel like the dev role. Because
Yeah.
I've seen like there's quite a lot of like really quite well known DevRel people on Twitter that I follow, and they're saying like to be like you need to be quite a good engineer in general to be kind of like good at DevRel kind of thing. Or like when people transition, they're like going from like quite senior positions of like a senior engineer into DevRel. So could you expand on what you meant by the kind of hard component to that?
Definitely. So I think so. I do not share that opinion, that same one about like that you have to be like an amazing engineer or a senior one even to be a dev role. And developer relations is like such a broad term as well. So like there's could be so many things that you would do. But for me, the transition, and I think that is something that probably a lot of engineers can actually like relate to, and that is, your day to day, right? Like the next morning you start a job, it is completely different than everything you've done so far. Like there's no sprint backlog to take like something from. There are no design meetings like going into things and thinking, hey, how are we going to architect this whole feature? We're going to need a queue and a messaging system and whatever, and I don't know, like all of those stuff. We're going to release it. How are we going to do December stuff? Like all of those all of that really deep engineering stuff, and like you'd get rusty at them doing the transition that at least I did at DevRel, which was not like an engineering focused DevRel role, right? Like my first week was like, hey, let's meet Snyk customers. Let's learn about the product. Let's write a blog post. There was a security incident. Let's create awareness on it. Actually, the first thing I did, the really big thing, like that was my first month in, and I'm really proud of that one. That was like creating and pushing out the state of open source security. Snyk, which is like I love that thing because it's like we can like curate a lot of stuff from the ecosystem. But I was like, oh, okay, so I need to write this thing. It's like, I don't know, like a 50 pages deep dive into data analytics of like all different sorts of stuff that's happening on the ecosystem. I was learning a lot, and also like trying like to extend myself from like what I was comfortable doing, and applying it to like different things that are required from you as like being, yes, a communicator in a sense by being a developer advocate. So me, I think I don't relate to the fact that you need to be a really good engineer, but you obviously, I think, need to have dev tooling companies at least a developer background, because that's like how you can relate to problems. Like if something is like, how do you relate to problems where developers are frustrated from a tool because it's maybe too slow in CI or has false positives or like different things. So kind of like, unless you've done that before, or unless you're like willing to learn that and like really understand and grasp that concept, it's really hard to be authentic and genuine about like understanding what is the problem case. So that I do relate to, and I think that's an important aspect.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head at the end about being genuine and authentic. I think like to be in that type of role, you really need to have like a lot of empathy, I think, especially for like people and product. So it's like a combination of both of those things. I think maybe I like kind of spoke when I meant like the people saying transitioning is hard. I was saying like it's more just like transitioning into a new role, but people that were
Yeah,
very technical were moving into those types of roles.
totally
Um,
agree.
so I have a question for you. So because you work for like a product security company, and that's ultimately what Snyk is, would you say that DevRel is different at like a security company compared to like, let's just say someone working at like Microsoft, or would you say that they're exactly the same thing, or just different contexts?
Hmm. I think the missions are ultimately the same. Like I say that a lot, and I really do believe in that. Like my mission in life, even before like joining Snyk, right? Like what did I do? I was like part of these foundations to help promote and advance web security for Node and stuff like that. So this is now my mission in life, is basically to make other developers secure and like code securely, and I don't know, like be successful in building whatever they're building, all their products in a secure way. Like this is what this is what I want to devote myself for. This is what I've been doing that for like the last 3 years. And I think you look at it from that perspective, from like that spectrum, it's the same for, I think, a lot of developers for other developer related companies, right? Like they want to make developers successful using their APIs or whatever, like using their product in this or that way, like whatever you're doing at like Microsoft or there's like a TypeScript team there, like a VS Code team there. They have the ultimate mission, right? Like they want to create awareness of VS Code, show how it's a really great tool, make developers successful writing code with that IDE versus others. So I think that the ultimate mission is the same. Maybe the way that you apply that or the way that you can go at it is a bit different, because security is a different aspect to, I don't know, API tooling or something else. So obviously I think that the lower level stuff are changing, and there's some stuff that you have to customize to the audience and where they are and what they do. But I think until the same goal. And hear what you think about it though. Do you feel it's the same, or do you feel it's different?
I mean, that's why I was primarily asking, because I obviously have been in consulting for so long, where it's kind of a bit of a DevRel thing. Anyways, because you're basically learning about all these services, you're learning about how you can better optimize for customers, so on. But I think I probably resonate with what you were saying about how the mission statements are ultimately the same, and I liked the way you did the crossover between if let's say there's some the TypeScript team, or there's the the VS Code team, they ultimately that's a product in reality, even if it's an open source thing, such as TypeScript. So, you need to have people that are on an advocacy side to be able to promote it and make sure that it becomes mainstream and adopted and actually being used, and finding all the issues and nuances that people that are interacting with the product has. So I think in many ways it's a success thing, and also kind of how you can evangelize and evolve and improve products. I think because it's it feels like a big feedback mechanism as well for most organizations.
It is. I think feedback is voice of the user is super important, right? This is how you learn stuff and how you need to improve, right? This is generally, by the way, I think a lot of companies today, and that's what I've been really surprised in a really good way when I've seen that happening over here. Product managers actually look at data to make their decisions, right? It's very database, looking at what's going on, where is their growth, where are there issues and frustrations. That's how they figure out where to invest. And I think that is something that I haven't seen before in previous companies I've worked at. I've definitely not seen that. It's a new startup kind of things where everyone are kind of doing that, and I just haven't picked it up on it. But I'm pretty sure that really relates a lot to their role as well. That's having those conversations with users is super important, all the time. And sometimes this is over DMs, because people kind of need help. They ping you and they ask a few questions about a product and say, hey, you really need to add bulk delete feature into this, because they're frustrated checking in checkbox. And I totally understand, we need to add that feature. I need to go back to the team and say hey, I know you probably heard about it before. I'm pretty sure I'm not the first one saying this 3 years into the company, but we kind of we really need it. Where is that getting held, or what can we do to prioritize this, or all of those things, maybe what are some workarounds and all of that. So that is super important.
I think that kind of goes to a lot of business decisions in general, and trying to get buy-in from organizations in general, without having relevant data, and without having accurate kind of decision making from data. A lot of the time they're just making kind of ifs or buts, or we think this probably is a good idea, sometimes without data. Sometimes you can do that and it's very successful. you can yeah, I think that's a good idea, let's just do that. But a lot of the time, if you're not actually using hard data to make your decisions, why should we support a language, let's say with Snyk, you now have a code scanning tool, you obviously static code analysis tools only support X amount of languages. But if you just decided to go and just one customer says they want Perl support, and then most of your customer base isn't even using Perl, that's kind of a bad roadmap decision. So obviously making the correct decisions for anything from a product to what features need to be included. I think that's really I think hitting the nail on the head. Let's put it that way.
I'll probably add that I think there's a lot of room for experimentation. That is what I really like about DevRel behind the scenes, where we can experiment with things. And I will probably maybe dive into it later, because it will come up with what did you build? What are you doing? But I can tell you that I've been surprised at like some of the stuff that we've built, and I was like, hey, this is like a side project for me, but it ended up being something very like popular and getting like adopted. I was like, well, that thing works. I don't know why, but this thing is pretty cool. So like that, making that room for experimentation and innovation is so important.
That's a good segue. Yeah, so let's move into like, so you're a big contributor to the open source world. You know, you became like, you got recognized as a GitHub Star. That's a very big accomplishment. Congratulations. You know, obviously, like you've been diving into the like JavaScript world, the Node.js world. You know, let's talk about some of your open source stuff and like to maybe talk about some of the projects that you've like felt like have been very impactful for you. I think that's probably a good segue into that.
Well, I guess it depends where we want to see it from, but I think starting off with just like the Node Foundation. Nowadays, I guess the OpenJS Foundation. I love referring it to the Node Foundation because that like grounds me there. But I think not only being part of that has been really impactful for me in terms of like actually taking part of like a really big project. Like Node is so big. There's so many working groups, so many people working on it, and also being able to like collaborate with people that have a lot of experience and like really smart people. And I've been amazed by how welcoming the community is across almost anywhere. Like it's been amazing to work with these people. And at least for me, being focusing on the security side of things, it was a lot of experience gaining from triaging vulnerabilities that people just sending and report stuff. So, I mean, that's been a lot of learning for me as well in terms of understanding much more closely how does that work, like how does CNA tap into this, like why CVEs take so long to assign and stuff like that. Also like connecting the maintainer and the security researcher, like being there like the glue and saying echoing things back, triaging, saying what's going on. To an extent, I remember that there's a lot of like sometimes conflicts and between what would be a vulnerability, and even that discussion, whereas for one of the sides might seem like very obvious, that's a lot to kind of like consolidate. So in a sense, you kind of like get you're there and like it feels like you are the mediator, which you're not, but you kind of like been assigned to because hey, now you're trying to like mediate this whole security vulnerability thing. So I mean, I wanted to call out the Node Foundation thing for like all of the work that we've been doing there, which is
Could we
great.
take two steps back and just, so the Node Foundation, could you like, so for some of the audience might not know what this is, could you take like a just like a little bit of a step back and just give what the high level is, and then obviously then we can go back to the being the glue between like reporting of vulnerabilities, that kind of
Sure. All of that changed.
yeah, no,
yeah. So if you know the Node.js project, right, like you know developer, or to an extent using the Node tooling, which you probably are as a JavaScript developer. So the Node Foundation is kind of the governing body, like the non-commercial for-profit kind of thing that handles that whole thing. And there's like an entire structure. There's like the technical steering committee, which kind of like oversees what's the roadmap, what's the 5-year strategy for the Node.js project and things like that. And then it trickles down into into working groups. One of them is the security working group. There's like a build working group. Like, how do you think you're getting the the Node.js Docker images? It's like a Docker related working group for that. Then there's something for streams and promises, and like they evolve and sometimes they die because like streams is not like well evolved, or promises is, and so like it dies off and something else begins. And there's ComCom and so many things. Like there's a lot of initiatives in the project itself, and there's like a governing body at the top that handles all of those stuff, but it happens in a very open manner. There's like this consensus decision-making kind of process where, for example, if you wanted to, suggest something like raise a PR to make a change in Node core, as long as no one says no, like that goes in, and that's like a very open and constructive way of like accepting things. And I haven't seen that before, prior to like working on the Node project. And like that has been like, very eye-opening. Like how do you make things, really work. And like think about it, it's like really it's maybe in a small scale of node compared to Linux as an OS. That's kind of like, you know, the cathedral and the badger, right? Like that's how organically you create software with, you know, I don't know, thousands of developers around the world contributing. If you think about it, there's no product manager, there's no CEO, but amazingly so, Linux is an OS that everyone uses. Same thing for Node and other projects, and somehow this works. Like these people figured out how to make that work, and I think that's a really fascinating philosophical way of looking at it. And I love just, you know, being part of that, and, you know, being able to like just lurk around, learn, and, you know, help promote whatever that is there. So I guess like a bit fast forward on that, just like on setting up the stage. And so the Node Foundation is not really the Node Foundation anymore. It's like the OpenJS Foundation, which is a bigger umbrella of projects like jQuery or things like that. I think like Fastify is there. If you're using Fastify or Express web application service, probably know those projects. Like it's there, and, you know, Node is part of that. And there's a security working group, I believe, at the OpenJS level 2. And so the top of that is probably like the Linux Foundation, which kind of like helps. You know, they've been doing this for like 3 decades or whatever, right? Yep. So it's, I don't know, 1990 something. So that's kind of like how everything fits together. It helps.
It does. Now so obviously you've mentioned the Node.js security working group has changed and evolved a little bit. Could you talk about like what the core properties are for the security working group? Like what are their responsibilities? Like obviously they technically don't have to do anything because, as you said, like they're not governed by anything. But like what are like the general responsibilities of the committee? Because you're obviously one of the committee members on the working group. So like what are your like general responsibilities as a committee member?
Yeah, I think just like as I think a working group member, but really, so what changed is the charter initially was set out, and I think was mostly around processes. Like how do we I don't say teach, but like how do we educate the ecosystem, like maintainers and everyone else, like how to handle security issues in general. So one of the things we were charted with is like, you know what, let's maybe put this like that was it. And some ideas that like spawned out of it is, let's have maybe a security.txt file that lives in a repository and says like what is the expected, you know, time, or like where to report issues and things like that, right? So all of those things that we kind of like wanted to bring in. So there's like a lot of processes that we try to share with the community, like how do you do things, as well as like internal processes for the Node.js, not the Node.js project itself, but the Node.js ecosystem, which is the full name of like this security working group. And I think what a lot of the work that has been going on, that has been behind the scenes, and that has been really what we've been doing a lot, and that is triaging vulnerabilities. So we've put out a program in HackerOne, which is a known kind of like bug bounty for security program thing. And then security researchers or anyone who would find a bug, like a security bug, on any NPM package that existed, would push it there, submit a report, say, you know, all the details, how to reproduce all of those things. And then we would have a process that says, well, if this is Lewis's package, let's contact him, let's bring him into the report, tell him about this vulnerability, let's fix it, let's triage it, you know, let's see that it's valid, first of all of those things. Let's coordinate the fix, let's create a CVE for it. There's like a lot of things around it, like what's the funny thing is like what's the CVSS score for it? Like how do you triage that? That's like sometimes really hard and complicated to do for libraries, because like it's not an actual product, it's something else. And like that library can be used in like a CLI mode or like over a network. There's so many different aspects for it. So like there are a lot of complexities that go behind the scene of like triaging a vulnerability. And I think that charter, like the security working group for Node, like where we've had this program and everyone would go there to file reports, has been I think the thing that actually like 90% of what the security working group was basically about. And I believe that more than a year ago, about a year ago back, probably a bit more, we've kind of stepped down from doing that. Like it was a lot of, as you can imagine, like all of this is happening voluntarily with, you know, amazing people on the working group that were, you know, extending themselves to do those kind of things, the price vulnerabilities. But we've been getting a lot of reports, like security vulnerabilities, and also like basically nudging maintainers to reaching out to them, and sometimes you have to like figure out like what does this mean? How do I get a hold of Luis? Like maybe he's not on Twitter, maybe he's not on LinkedIn. I need to like go to like the commits of GitHub if I can find them, find an email related to that, and then like ping you. Maybe it lands on your spam folder. Like there's a lot of stuff going on there to add complexity. So I think what ended up happening is we were getting into a state where the queue of vulnerabilities was increasingly going up without us being able to handle them. We did not want to keep that state, so we've kind of like did a call out for if there's any company or anyone who maybe wants to like take that. Snyk ended up taking that. The security team took the backlog and are like triaging those vulnerabilities. But basically, like that's what we've been doing. That's what has been the focus for it. And funny thing that you ask about the charter, because I believe that last week or the week, last week I think it was, where I was like posting an issue on the working group GitHub repo, and it's like saying, hey, we're not doing any more vulnerabilities triage. Should we do something else? And Daniel Roof has been a great valued member of like the working group, has been adding some ideas of like maybe some stuff that we should do, like best practices and other things. So if anyone is listening to this and would like to like has ideas and would like to contribute and be part of this, definitely check it out.
I'm gonna just wait for a second. Just wait for a second. Yeah, you can contact me. Yeah, pick me. No, that's really interesting to hear about like the evolution of that, because I could imagine like how many vulnerabilities actually occurred, like, or like because obviously for a long time, right, people would just obviously report like a couple of issues, like they would like look for, let's just say, prototype pollution, and then they would go ahead and spam every single like node repository, right? And then whenever they would find one, they would report it to the node ecosystem. But I think obviously vulnerability reporting and like issues in like, I guess I would say like the node ecosystem are getting more kind of like understood, I think, over time, which obviously probably and like I think there's still a lot of room to grow for like secure defaults and for improving security in general from a hygiene perspective. So I could imagine like there's a steady increase of like people's understanding of like issues and how to test for issues from either a code or dynamic perspective, or even just like running code and like seeing what objects can be included in like clone functions or whatever. Like people like experiment with that all the time now. I could just imagine like there's this kind of like just large increase of issues. So I could imagine how that would become very near impossible to maintain.
That's like a lot of work.
Awesome. So that's really, so like obviously when you, because the Node Security Working Group, let's say like you had your one kind of objective which was more about like third party like dependencies and like, or like ecosystem of Node, of the packages that are being leveraged. You said like you're looking for new things to do. So like the working group stays the same. It's just maybe its objectives change. Is that kind of like a good way to understand it?
It could be. I think it's like at a point where I think like for a long time that it's like without a job. So like there are people there, and we don't care about the security of stuff. But like since that is not anymore part of what we would do, like what would it be? So one decision could be, we expired the working group. Like that's fine, right? Like done a lot of work, and like if there's nothing else to do, that we can do, that's fine to make that decision. It's never nice to like fun to like kill a project or whatever. But again, like also like if it's just there for staying, that maybe there's no like reason for doing that. There are like a lot of other like corresponding like branches of things. Like we could say like hey, we've actually learned a lot and did a lot at the Node foundation level. Let's pick it up like the OpenJS. Like we actually become the working group also for like a lot of other projects, like again like Fastify and like other projects on the OpenJS foundation that maybe could use our experience, our expertise in like triaging vulnerabilities and fixing them and creating processes around it. Maybe we can help them secure and like educate maintainers what it means to be a secure maintainer, like not choosing bad passwords, enabling 2FA, and using log files, whatever you want to be as like your favorite best practice. But there's a lot we could do, and I think figuring out what that is, what would be impactful and useful, but also maybe either correlated to the Node.js or the OpenJS, depending on the scope of what it would be, is something we need to do. Like we need to reason about it, something like that.
Got it. Now, obviously, like you've looked at a lot of vulnerabilities, obviously through your triaging time. What would you say, like some of your favorite ones that you've seen, like that you could talk about, either from like a vulnerability class or just like the types of impact that it would have had or it has had from the types of issues that you found through the working group
A good one.
that are public, of course.
I think most of the reports are probably public. I'm gonna pick something maybe that I remember a case where it was, it's not about the vulnerability itself, but it was about like how we handled things. And I think it says a lot about maybe some frustrations that people have with like what looks to be like a security theater and stuff like that. So it's about like probably trash, prototype pollution, and CLI stuff related, like command execution and all of those things. So we've seen a lot. Also, getting to the point where that vulnerability is actually relevant or not is really important. And I won't name the project, and I think the report is out or something. So like if anyone wants to like dig in, they'll find it. But I was triaging a vulnerability for a project that, to me it seems very legitimate. But the maintainers and like obviously the security researcher, but they have other incentives, right? So like that's not a really biased person. Um, but the maintainer said, like, my project is for testing purposes. Like, what if you find, I don't know, an XSS ingest in some way, or like in Mocha, like something else, right? Like you'd say it's for testing purposes, or like, you're not using it the way that you should do it, which are totally get the maintainers in that sense, because I'm a maintainer myself, so like I get that point. But you do not know how people use your projects, and whatever, you can put something in the README, but if no one reads the README and your default is insecure, that's setting up people maybe to generally fail. Like you could tell them read the README, but that's a problem. So that is at least like my view for it. And so we've had this like a lot of discussions and ongoing in that vulnerability triage report. Like, is it or is it not, or is it or is it not, and trying to convince. And of course, we do not want to oppose anything on a maintainer. So we kind of like ended up having like this middle ground of like, hey, okay, put some kind of like this security disclaimer at the top, says, careful of this and that API or whatever. And that's it. Uh, but it's something that taught me that a lot of those things are not really straightforward. Like it might seem like a security for me, but maintainers really have like a different way of looking at things. And they have different expectations of how users would use the system and what risk they would take, which is different from what would happen if you are not even myself, the triager or the security researcher, but what would like the AppSec policy team in a company would be, or what would the CISO kind of like compliance or whatever policies would be. So that really taught me a lot. And I mean, the other stuff, like you could just Google HackerOne, like scrape it or something, and you could find out of the reports that I was working on and find something. So like I would choose this story over the others.
That's a really interesting topic because I've seen like a lot of like horror stories or like, well, there's a few things, right? I'd like to break it up into a few components. One, it's a pretty heavily used product. There's issues found, and ultimately sometimes they just remove features. There was obviously like in some of the Node ecosystem, there was like some parsing libraries that like they had a vulnerable parsing process, and they basically just removed the entire feature because it was like a deserialization thing. So they basically just completely removed it, and then that's gone. That's one kind of like process that people take. The other one is obviously what you mentioned around understandings of how things are used, and in reality that's a completely I think it's a fine mentality to have, but then obviously if people are using it the wrong way, which obviously can normally be found through like looking at how they're used in open source projects, that could obviously lead to X, Y, and Z. And then finally, there's obviously the kind of like large kind of combination between like where the issue is happening, which you mentioned. Like, is it happening in a CLI application? Is it happening in normally this backend process, or is it happening in like the direct dependency, or is it happening in the transient dependency, which obviously like sometimes leads to like where like it's normally like an additional library that's used in most products, and it's like for most of the time it's never actually going to hit that type of issue. So I can imagine like there's a lot of kind of like nuances when you're actually triaging these things, because you have to take all of those things into consideration, not just because technically like yes, that function or whatever piece of code or software is vulnerable, but is it vulnerable in the right like in the right context? I think, and there's no easy answer for that, and it's a really hard thing to think about.
There's a lot there. We could talk about this like for 2 hours. I can give you another aspect, which is CLIs. Like there's like I think if you're using a CLI and there's like an arg parser that is used in the wrong way, and someone can actually abuse it to like spawn some programs or whatever, I think that's a valid vulnerability, right? And I think about it like that because I do think that if someone is able to like create privilege escalation out of like a tool into something else that they are not supposed to run, that's a problem. And a lot of other people, including in the Node.js project itself, they're saying, right, like if you're using Node and you're running it as root, that's already a problem, right? Like you should not run it as root, and then whatever privilege escalation will it will not happen because it will be contained to that user maybe. So they do not accept like things that are like in CLIs and stuff like that. And so it's like I personally see it differently as an actual issue, because developers sometimes like they write code. We can ponder on like how much developers understand how exactly their applications are running. Do they like even know that that application needs to run as root? Do they know if they're running it as root? Do they know if they're running like if they're writing their own Docker files, which happened for my team before I joined team Snyk. My team was actually like writing the Docker file. We had there wasn't any like user default something there, so the fact it was not there, it was running as root. But like how would I know that? I not like a DevOps person, whatever, not like a Docker expert. I was taught like this is Docker file, this is how you run it. So all of those things that they don't have like the reach of understanding that. And so saying if to begin with you're running Node as root, that's a problem. It's like it's sometimes it's kind of like it's missing a lot of what is actually happening on the system. So while that is a really good best practice not to run it as root, or it's something that you'd recommend, is different from what happens. So what happens now when you need to triage a vulnerability for something that is related to that? So I don't know. There's like a lot of conflicting stuff with security in that sense.
More than a few. I want to jump. I'm going to jump through a few avenues left. I know, like obviously, we have we're halfway through the stream or a bit over the stream. So, what I would want to do is like we're talking about Node right now, and I kind of want to showcase like your the security best practices that you started to work on, or the awesome security stuff. So I'm gonna jump into that real quick, and then if you could just talk about it. So you have the awesome Nodejs security repository that you made. My transforms set transform. All right, so you have this awesome Node.js security project. So could you talk about like how this became to be, and like who it would be useful for? Like anyone like working in like the ecosystem or working in any type of that kind of manner.
Yeah, so I started this one as like I wanted to basically get a list. It started with like a personal list that I had, like putting links for different stuff, and then I was saying, hey, well, you know what, let's curate that and put it on GitHub so we can work on it together with other people, and basically say, these are books for if you want to level up on security. These are tools that you could use. These, when all of the like the security incidents really started happening, I started curating them and like resources to them because people wanted to read. I wanted to read like the post-mortem of get cookies or something else. I don't know. So like all of those things were really interesting, and I just wanted to like keep them somewhere. So I think that repository is basically that. That's kind of like what we're trying to do with it. I don't know if you have access that one way, so like a contributor. I don't remember, but if you don't, we should do it because there's like a bunch of people who have that. Just that like this is my trick, by the way, of getting people involved in open source projects. What I do is the first time they like contribute something to one of my projects, I'd like promote them to a contributor or something like that. Before you yell at me, supply chain security and event stream, and talk about it. But like this is like an interesting way of like just scaling out and letting people, feel a bit of belonging to the project and other things that you're working on. So a lot of other people have contributed to, I think, this repository, but mainly we're trying to just keep it up to date. So anything that happens on the ecosystem or new tools or stuff like that, we're just kind of like pushing into it.
Yeah, I have a couple of suggestions. I think I've contributed to Yari's. I think his name is Yari. He has like another security, like Node.js best practice list. So I think I've contributed to that list. I think it's called something. I forgot his name completely. But yeah, this is an awesome resource to look at because at least from my perspective is that you kind of like put everything in a nice little kind of, if someone's never looked at the Node.js kind of ecosystem before and want to understand like some of the security components or like how to get started by like trying to hack stuff because you have like references to Juice Shop and NodeGoat and DomGoat and stuff. I think this is like an awesome kind of like primer into basically being able to understand some of this stuff. Now, the next thing I want to really kind of like cover over the last part of this stream is just let's talk about some of the kind of like best practices when it comes to those third-party things, right? Because obviously a lot of the like Node ecosystem generally comes from trying to like install like Node packages and leverage them. At least a lot of the time. Obviously, there are vulnerabilities in utilizing the framework itself and some of the like command execution, cross-site scripting, all that all that jazz. But obviously, a lot of the vulnerabilities tend to come from like third-party libraries these days because like there's that whole like image online somewhere where it's like your application and it's like mostly like Node modules and then like your code, which is like a very small circle in the middle kind of thing. So could we talk about some of like obviously you've written some tools like NQX and some and like also like is your website vulnerable? Could we talk about some of those things about like like what are the kind of concepts behind like those types of things and what do you need to be concerned about when you're like utilizing third-party libraries?
Yeah, cool. So maybe I'll start with is website vulnerable just because I think that one has pretty cool angle to it from like the open source and surprise that it's had in me, and that is it started off as like a side project for like the weekend, and I was working back then on some integration with web page test that Snyk has.
Yep.
And out of that, I like learned a lot of stuff, like how do you fingerprint JavaScript libraries and their versions running on the DOM without like having access to a manifest file. So like there's a whole project, by the way, that's maintained by a team that has like a fingerprint for all of those kind of like different libraries, like jQuery and Angular and like so many things.
Yep.
It's a pretty cool thing. So I was thinking, what if you just had like this CLI, like you just literally type in npx is website vulnerable, with like the dashes between the words, put a website in, and it will tell you what JavaScript libraries do you have, versions if we can detect them, and actually also it will compare that to the Snyk database and tell you if they are vulnerable or not. So for example, for a lot of like WordPress and like outdated websites, you might find a lot of issues there. So this is really it. Like I'm a CLI sucker. I love CLIs, and like this is like a super simple project. There's like nothing complicated in the technical feasibility of what it is, but it's a pretty cool, straightforward, simple project. And what it ended up being, it's got featured on like some newsletters and got like viral on Twitter a bit and GitHub trending and stuff like that. And so people started it more, and there was like a community around it. And again, this is what's amazing on open source. Like someone went in, and I think it was Matt Travey. He's a really cool guy. He was like creating, I think, a GitHub action out of that. And like he was using it. And like, by the way, if you like go to GitHub Actions Marketplace right now, go to the security category and search for, go to like the search and search for a security. You'll find that one, this project, like the top. And I was like blown when that was happening. I was like, why? But it's useful. Like he was using it. He was like creating a GitHub action. He was adding it as like run scripts. Actually run like in a CI when you do like npm test. Actually do that as well and like run these website vulnerable CLI to actually make sure that whatever you deploy to some staging or whatever doesn't have JavaScript vulnerabilities. Again, like there are better ways of doing that, like Snyk and npm audit and others, where you have the manifest and you know exactly what's running there. But sometimes you can't, or whatever for other reasons. Like it's a nice tool. So that's my story for it. It's like a super simple project, side project. That's why I want to connect this to like the DevRel experimentation and engineering. Like I did not think this will like blow up, but it was more than getting popular. For me, it was like when a lot of people contributed to it, I felt that it was giving the space needed for a lot of people to basically chime in and like bring in their thoughts. Like someone added a minus JSON to give you like a JSON output, not just like a fancy CLI stuff. So it's pretty cool. It created opportunities for others to basically take part in open source, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think like even like you say, it's quite a simple tool, but in reality, like obviously there are, I think like these types of things, especially in the security space, are like good ways for people to get involved in writing, just writing code for the first time. Because yes, like it's basically just doing like a GET request, once you've like used this library. You mentioned there's like this popular like thing where I don't know if you had to write the code to basically like do the fingerprinting, but like if there is already a library that can do the fingerprinting, you import that package. You maybe use Puppeteer or whatever or curl or whatever. Probably you have to use probably Puppeteer. There's obviously Playwright now, which is like super popular. Use Puppeteer. You then obviously in the DOM, leverage that thing to pull out and like query like are you using dollar something for jQuery or Angular dot or like Vue has all of these types of things. Then process that information and then basically either do a JSON output or make things beautiful. And then the extra step, make a GET request make things beautiful. Make a GET request to the Snyk free repository list, because obviously I think the Snyk repo is free to like query, etc. At least from the web perspective, I think, because it's obviously a vulnerability database. There probably is a pro version, but like there obviously you can use it for free.
There's like a JSON database that's available for the front end stack. So that actually you could just take that. It's not even web. It's like just JSON.
There you go, and then output that information. That's like a beautiful way to get someone to like learn how to like see how like a general application is built from the ground up, and it's kind of like a really nice thing.
Definitely.
So let's now move on to MPQ, because the way that I think about this, I think it's a good segue because we can talk about like because from the way I imagine like MPQ to be is that it's basically like most of the vulnerabilities that you think about, like from like a third-party management perspective. So like project maturity, licensing violation potentially. If it doesn't have a license, because that's pretty bad if you're going to use that in an actual like production environment, especially if you're like a vendor that has to be concerned about those things because you don't want to get sued or anything of that nature. And then finally, like there's like lock files and other stuff. So obviously I don't think this does lock files, but like and obviously pre and post install scripts. So could you like talk about some of those things and like some of the best practices maybe that might be useful for anyone?
Yeah, so the way I was thinking about it back then is, if you think about it now, right? Like let's flip it up. Do npm install something, and once it's done, it will tell you how many vulnerabilities it has, right? And so, I mean, that is great for like awareness. And some people don't like it because sometimes it reports false positives or something else, and like that creates some like negative effect, whatever. Like I won't go into that discussion. I ultimately think it was a good decision because it creates security awareness for developers, and that's helpful.
I agree.
Great. The security people agreeing on security. That's
yeah, we both already like drink from the same kind of Kool-Aid. Like, yeah, let's agree with that. It's like me and you. It's like you and that security researcher arguing with the developer.
True. However, I do not. I think I'm still a developer more than I'm a security person. But whatever.
Yeah.
I'm doing that. So so like I mean, you do that, but then you like find out that whatever you installed has vulnerabilities in it. So I was like thinking like, well, why wouldn't you know before you were installing it that it has vulnerabilities? Like you could say, I do not want to install it, at least not that version. And what would you suggest instead? Also, like, what happens if you install a malicious version? Like the whole Rimruff, all event stream, all of those like slew of packages that had EastLint config, all those things that had like malicious versions or they were a malicious package themselves. And like once you install it, it will actually run those pre or post installed scripts and I don't know, like read your .npm or C, read your .env variables, whatever that is. So after you install it, that doesn't help you to tell you that it's malicious, because like that already happened and packages can run arbitrary code. That's a problem. Or commands. And so that's kind of like the mindset that I got into, like when like building NPQ was like, if we build a CLI like npm, it basically is just wrapping it. Like I've created like an alias for it. Like you could alias npm for npq for npm. So when you do that, basically you run npm install, and what it does is it goes through a set of checks that says, does it have pre or post install scripts and what they are. So like what's going to happen in a second, and probably should be aware that this this is a really good warning sign for you. Could be legitimate, but someone could actually do rm-rf/drive or whatever, and that's like game over. What if like it has 20 downloads or something, because like at that point maybe this is a typo squatting attack, because maybe you had a typo and it's probably like not the React that you actually meant to download, but some other thing, because you had like a typo in the way that you typed React really quick in the CLI. So it has all of those checks, and if it finds like some of these like discrepancies, like if they don't pass a threshold, it actually tells you, do you want to install it or not? So it's a tool where it's not useful to run as a CI kind of task, because like that's like already automated and like there's no DTY and stuff there, there's no interactivity. But for developers, for them, like for me and you, not being the target of all of those kind of like malicious packages and potentially vulnerabilities, this is a great tool. So extent, I don't know how NPQ did not end up as a functionality in npm. I definitely on my end I did not like raise this, but like I think people knew about it in general, so like it's not any secret anywhere. But I think it's like it is something that we should. The next improvement is not to think about this stuff after the fact, but rather before things are happening. For me today, it connects a lot to supply chain security. And I did not think too deeply supply chain security when I built NPQ, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years back. Now I see how it's like so connected to that existential issue where we are dependent on registries and what gets in there, and maintainers getting compromised and all sorts of things happening in the ecosystem. And supply chain security is I won't dive into it, but I'll let you like
Yeah.
I'll stop for you IT before you
Yeah, we have like we could do an entire episode just on, I think, supply chain security and like each component to it, like what are the risks here, like what are the best practices. We have a few minutes left, and obviously I know that you're in a wonderful space today where you have kind of have a close to a hard cutoff. So what would be some of the things that you would recommend to developers, like around, like, at least let's just talk about like third-party ecosystem. Like, what are some of the best practices that you would like recommend people to walk away from today that they should think about doing, or they can start doing today?
So for maintainers, I think there's a lot in terms of like the security hygiene of their accounts, and I think I've got like this npm security best practices cheat sheet thing which goes through it and kind of like says enable 2FA, use correct passwords, do all sorts of things that would be helpful for you. Like definitely that, right? That helps you as a maintainer, like have those, like have CI checks in place, have those Snyk npm, right? Whatever you want, just like have those checks in place for vulnerabilities in your third-party dependencies and all of those things. Also, of course, like both as a developer and a maintainer, it's about like knowing how to choose packages, like how's the community around it, how's the maintenance, like what's going on there. There's like a lot of due diligence that we now have to do. Always needed to do, but I think now it became much more apparent that we have to do it when we bring in new dependencies or we want to swap in one for the others. So there's that. For developers, I think again, there's like a lot between the tooling itself, like knowing that for npm, if you do npm install, you actually allow other packages. By the way, any package on that dependency tree to, like, if there's like thousands dependencies in general that you would do that you would get when you do npm install, if one of them gets compromised and does anything like a pre-post install hook, you just do npm install, that's it. Like someone could get in, right? Like, so knowing that you have this like --ignore script, or you could put that into .npm or C and have this like as a default for the team, That is really important, like because like this kind of creates the awareness, right? Like the team now understands where the security vulnerability, where the weaknesses are, and can like act accordingly. And actually, on that note, I will say that moving into upgrading into NPM 7 or 8, at least on that sense, would actually be a really good advice, because 7 and 8, which was just recently released, um, those npm CLI versions actually treat the ignore scripts in that npm-rc only for the installed packages, not for the project's package JSON, which has been kind of like frustrating back then. Like if you've added that one and you wanted to run like npm test or something, it would also fail because it will tell you, hey, you ignored scripts. So the new version actually fixed that, and that is like a very welcoming change. And like, you know, kudos to like the npm team on GitHub for doing that. So there's like a lot of those tips. And actually working on a document, I think we'll be interested on like supply chain security best practices for JavaScript developers and projects. Like I'm building this whole thing, and it's going to be about CI and developers and maintainers and proxies. And we've had this like issue recently with dependency confusion happening, which is like showing us how, again, like these can come and hunt us from like different ideas that we haven't thought about before, but it's still like the supply chain and like how much we are dependent on open source and third-party libraries. So there's like a lot. I hope that the repositories that you shared are a good starting point for everyone. But other than that, I would say hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions, or just Luis and nag him because, you know, maybe he has more time than mine. But yeah, I mean, we'll be both really happy to help anyone. So I'll welcome everyone to just ping us.
Completely agree. It's been a while since I've looked at this kind of stuff, so it was a great time today, Liran. And I think that's a good time to end the stream. So honestly, Liran, this has been a great hour. I really have appreciated like you joining us today, and giving your knowledge and sharing some of your projects. And I really obviously enjoyed learning about the I think the highlight for me was learning about the Yoda hat, because it's not like bugged me, but I've just wanted to know for so long like where it came from. So now I know it came from France. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis.
All right, so that was episode 13 of SecuriTEA Crumpets. Please join us next time, episode 14, probably next month.